I'm a little disappointed that there wasn't more interest shown in my 5-part series. But in one of those parts, I started discussing prerogative writs as it related to the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison that involved James Madison. Marbury, who was an appointed Justice of the Peace of Washington, D.C., by John Adams as he was leaving office. Well, if you want to know more about that, you could Google it or check out the second part of my last series. But I started to get into the area of separation of powers, which also touches upon, necessarily involves, I should say, sovereignty. And it's kind of an interesting thing because in the United States you have a group of people that refer to themselves as New Federalists. They go by the name now. They have a group called the Federalist Society, who in actuality are the exact antithesis of what the Federalist Party were. They are essentially what the anti-Federalists were, the people that were opposed to the Constitution. And those people are essentially the states' rights enthusiasts. You sometimes hear them champion the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and things like that. And the primary purpose of their existence was to support slavery. And over the years, it was something that developed in the United States largely as a fallacy that has a lot to do with the 11th Amendment, which I am in favor of abolishing. But if you stop and think about it, sovereignty, you hear the word more often than not associated with a sovereign nation. Or you hear it in terms of a king or queen, the sovereign of a nation, or even in terms of a coin, a sovereign coin. Well, all of it comes from the idea of an individual as an individual sovereign being. The nature itself of the individual, which everything that we say and do is defined in terms of. It's according to our perception. So we are, in effect, a sovereign individual. Well, the Federalist Party recognized this, as everyone in the Enlightenment recognized this. If you look at the Law of Nations by Emmerich Vattel, he discusses in the Law of Nations how the Law of Nations originated. And the Law of Nations, which sets forth the idea of sovereignty appertaining to states and nations, is directly based upon the idea of individual sovereignty. In other words, if individual sovereignty did not exist or was some sort of a fiction, then the idea of state sovereignty or national sovereignty could not exist because it was extrapolated therefrom. But so when you stop and think about this, it's kind of an interesting thing, and I thought I'd discuss it a little bit in terms of a monarch. How does a monarch come to be? Well, most of the monarchies, I think all of the monarchies that existed in Europe, was based on the idea of divine right. It's a miracle. The man is king. It's some miracle of God himself. In England, it was different. In England, which people in the United States, the so-called founding fathers, recognized as the most highly evolved form of government then extant at the time the Constitution was created, has sovereignty coming about in a little bit different of a manner, because in England, the sovereign is recognized as the lord of the land. He's the ultimate lord of the land. So how did that happen? Well, by postulate or otherwise, this particular person or one of his ancestors fought battles and wars and things and came into possession of this large piece of land. And this was then divided up upon the people that helped him do this, primarily the heads of these different military units and things, which are recognized as the lords. So essentially you have the lords, like the House of Lords, the lords of the land, where the idea of landlord comes from. So that in England, for instance, when you do something like disturb the peace, it's considered to be a contempt against the lord of the land. Whereas in the United States, under the states, if you commit some sort of a crime, misdemeanor, or infraction, code infraction, as they're referred to nowadays, it's considered to be a contempt against the people. You have criminal cases in the various states, the people of New York or people of Pennsylvania or whatever, versus the accused. So the way that this was related to the Marbury v. Madison case is that the various functions of the monarch when he held court, people that the lords of the land would have grievances with the crown, and the crown would hold court. They would come and express their grievances. And as the population increased and things got more complicated, he delegated these powers to a separate body, a court body. However, these powers came from him as the sovereign, but also came from him as an executive officer, the head of the nation being the chief executive officer, like the President of the United States. So, for instance, in the U.S. Constitution, there's this power to appoint judges, justices of the Supreme Court, and so on and so forth, with the advice and consent of the Senate. Because the Senate in the United States is very similar to the function of lords in England. You have 2 senators from each state. One of the other aspects of this has to do with feudalism as compared with capitalism. Now, capitalism is kind of a hot topic these days. And it's kind of interesting to see how it came about. Of course, in England, you had this system of feudalism where you had the lords were controlled in certain pieces of land, estates, and the people were known as serfs or vassals or whatever. Similar to how we are in the United States. But the people under the feudal system were more like the slaves were in the southern states, as they lived on these estates and things. So as far as the future or any sort of meaningful existence, it was rather bleak. But eventually what happened is the population size increased and you started having conflicts among the various lords. For instance, as their means of production became more successful, the proficient or whatever, they had surpluses, and they would hold fairs. And they'd have conflicts because Lord Halifax was holding his fair at the same time I did. I was unable to sell my product. So they'd go to court and complain about that. So what came of this was that there was a group of people that rose up between the cracks and crevices of the landed gentry, as they were known. And they did so with capitalism. They did so by paying in money that they had, or whatever sort of property they could have, into a group effort. Now, one of the early attempts at this were joint stock companies. People would put capital together, you know, maybe I have a horse, this man has a cart or whatever. So they'd pool together these assets and go on an adventure to get some sort of surplus from some other person or trade with some other person. And eventually this evolved into what became capitalism. So in this sense, capitalism was actually a form of escape from feudalism. And when you think of this in terms of the New World and people assembling together to constitute a new government, a new union, capitalism was looked at upon that time. It was a part of the Enlightenment. It was a means for escaping the old ways. It was a new enterprise, a new beginning. So what a lot of these people that were the so-called founding fathers, what a lot of them had in common was the desire, the true and honest desire to have a new beginning, to not repeat things that were done in England, for instance, where you had, well, as I was saying with the court system, part of the legal system in England was actually evolved from vestiges of the papal power, you know, the Pope, and this was the Chancery and the Exchequer. And these powers were thought of as distinct from the powers of the crown. And eventually what happened was the throne assimilated these functions into the executive branch of government. So there were powers that came under the crown. And then eventually when Charles II, he was beheaded because he was Roman Catholic, and you had the Republicans, they abolished the monarchy, and you had a Republican form of government for a while, burning witches and things like that. Eventually the monarchy was restored, but what you had when the monarchy was restored was you had a form of dual monarchy, dual sovereignty, which was later adopted by conservatives in the United States to explain the distinctions between the sovereignty of the United States and the sovereignty of the states. But it's a fiction. And largely the fiction evolved because of the 11th Amendment. The 11th Amendment does not read